The cold northern sea stretched endlessly. The early morning mist swirled around the giant steel blocks that were starting up in the middle of the harbor. The massive iron ship carried 5 weather-beaten fishermen and headed out to sea. The dawn reflected on the bright yellow jackets, the color of the sea, of work, of a long day about to begin. They quietly prepared the ropes, nets, and spears. Everything was as familiar as the breathing of this ocean. The ship's engine roared. Each loop of rope was pulled taut. The pulleys whistled softly. The sea wind whipped into the faces of the men who had lived half their lives on the water. They didn't say much. Each man knew his role. This wasn't the first trip out to sea, nor would it be the last. The ship accelerated, leaving behind the quiet harbor, rushing into the vast turquoise waters. When the horizon was only waves, the watchman climbed to the top of the steel tower.
It's a huge one! Get the cameras! Woo! Oh my God!
Heave! Pull! Together. All right, let's go further. Hold it steady. Almost there. Watch the ropes. Stabilize those lines. Woo!
His eyes to look into the distance. The first signal appeared, a towering column of water bursting from the sea. Whale, the ocean's giant breath. The air on board was suddenly as tense as a bowstring. Every movement became urgent but precise. The net thrower prepared. The rope holder held the rope. The spear holder stood ready. In the turquoise water, a huge black shadow began to appear just below the bow. The bow tilted slightly. The decisive moment had come. The spear thrower took a deep breath, then threw it like an arrow piercing the salty air. A dry crash sounded. The pulleys screeched. The ship shook as the rope stretched to its limit. The giant whale began a fierce resistance, pulling the entire ship to the side. But on the deck, no one backed down. 5 men, their yellow jackets stained with seawater, pulled the rope together, keeping every inch of distance. The fight dragged on.
Pull that in, come on. Move it there. A little more to the left.
Splashed white. Arms rolled with veins. Wires screamed in the air. Sweat, seawater, and whale blood mixed together to create a heavy, salty smell. Finally, the giant animal grew tired. Its massive body drifted to the side of the ship. Step by step, they used a pulley system to pull it closer, until the whale's shadow covered half the hull. The rumble of steel cranes echoed on the deck. The giant blue whale was slowly lifted from the water, dumping tons of white water into the water. 5 fishermen stood watching, their yellow shirts shining in the midday sun. The steel of the ship, the water, the sweat, all in one. Once the whale was safely on the deck, the real work began. Long, sword-like flensing knives were drawn. They marked each cut. Each strike was as precise as if they had done it 100 times. The giant mass of flesh was slowly peeled away layer by layer.
Hold it.
The sound of knives cutting flesh. The sound of iron hooks piercing skin. The sound of pulleys pulling. Created a cold and decisive industrial soundtrack. Large pieces of meat were hooked to iron hooks, suspended and turned to one side, while the remaining parts continued to be cut into small pieces. Under the blazing sun, water, oil, fat and blood mixed together on the cold, wet steel floor. No one stopped. Every movement was rhythmic like a precision-operated machine. When the work at sea was finished, the ship towed the giant whale back to the port. The sky was already turning dusk. Giant industrial cranes on the shore were ready to welcome them. The ship's whistle sounded deep. 5 men, drenched in sweat and seawater, watched as the crane gradually lifted the giant mass of meat out of the water, like lifting a part of the ocean onto the shore.
Pull up. Watch it. Slowly.
Workers and heavy equipment worked in unison. The whale was lowered onto a giant steel cutting platform. The golden light reflected off the wet fish skin. The clanging of metal echoed across the harbor. The commander gave the signal. The knife slashed. The chain tightened. The cable pulled taut. Huge chunks of meat were brought up the conveyor belt. Steel wheels crunched on the wet floor. 5 fishermen entered the workshop. It was no longer the stormy sea. This was another world. Noisy,
Let's start the line.
bright, and cold. Saws, cranes, conveyor belts, cranes, all moving in a rhythmic rhythm like the heart of a steel monster. They stood on the high floor, watching the entire factory operate below. Huge chunks of fish meat ran along the conveyor belt. The machine knives cut into precise pieces. The cranes rotated. The fat press roared. Everything was immersed in a silent mechanical symphony. The chains screeched. The engines roared.
Move it quickly!
The chains screeched. The engines roared. The wheels crunched water, all mixed with white steam rising up in waves. The salty air of the sea. The smell of machine oil. The smell of fresh meat. The cold smell of the factory created a dense atmosphere, like that only found in places on the edge of the world. Each crate of meat was weighed, pressed, packaged, Forklifts moved them into the cold storage. The cold air was hazy. The sweat on the men's faces turned into a white layer of salt. Although tired, they did not move from their positions. No one said a word. The sound of machines replaced human voices. Finally, the captain pulled down the giant red lever. The assembly line stopped. The factory was plunged into a moment of silence. Steam still rose. Yellow lights reflected on the wet concrete. Iron hooks still swung by inertia.
Coach, get ready. Finally.
Yeah, that's done.
The last pallet is in.
But the battle was over. The fishermen took off their gloves and wet coats, standing by the factory wall looking out at the night sea. In the distance, the giant iron ship lay still in the cold mist. No one spoke, only the sound of water dripping from the old floor into the drain. A long day had ended. They left the factory in silence, their heavy footsteps echoing on the wet concrete. The night mist covered the harbor. In the distance, yellow lights reflected on the mirror-like surface of the water. When they stopped, turned their heads to look back at the ship, all that remained was a black shadow standing tall in the dim light. 5 figures in those yellow shirts, small in front of the night sea, in front of the giant factory, but carrying on their shoulders a whole day of brutal labor. As they stepped out of the frame, they left behind a picture of a cold industrial world where human power and steel merged into a never-ending cycle. The camera slowly rose above. The night sea opened up. The ship was silent like a giant mass of sleeping steel. The harbor was still lit but no longer made a sound. The voyage out to sea, hunting, pulling in the whale, processing on shore, all ended in a single day. This is not a heroic story. This is a story of cycles, of people, of the sea, and of machines. As the machinery died down, the harbor fell silent. The yellow industrial lights no longer shone brightly, only flickering like small flames in the cold night. On the steel-black water, the giant ship stood still, towering like a mass of memory. It had been a long, fiery day, of sea, of wind, of human power. The 5 men in yellow jackets were now just small silhouettes on the vast harbor. They were silent, but their heavy footsteps told a story.